Hi! So far you've created a stand collar, which is a two-piece collar. So the collar that you've created is like the one I'm wearing now. You have a stand which is connected to the neckline, and then the collar is connected to the stand. Now this helps the collar sit snugly around the neck. The stand is done up with a button here, and then the buttons continue down the front. What I'm going to show you now is how to create an all-in-one collar. The difference between this and this one is that the stand is not a separate piece. The stand is included in the collar. This means that the collar doesn't sit as tightly around the neck. It's a more relaxed look. It sits open like this. You'll notice also that there's not usually a button at the top at the neckline. So it's designed to be worn open. It's a more casual look. You'll see it in a lot of vintage casual menswear, as well as in sportswear and Hawaiian shirts. So if we have a look at the all-in-one collar, you can see that there's no stand here. Instead, there's a roll, and this roll line is acting more or less as a stand would in a two-piece collar. At this junction, looking on different shirts with all-in-one collars, you can see they have different shapes here. Sometimes they have a little angle. This one is a smooth line. The other thing that you'll notice on a all-in-one collared shirt is that they don't have center front plackets. They usually have a facing like this one. So this one is all-in-one with a fold, so it's folded on this edge. You'll also get shirts with a stitching line down here, and the facing would be bagged out and finished like this. Starting with a little piece of paper on the fold, I've drawn the fold line in here, and now I'm going to mark a right angle along the bottom. So using the straight edge of the grading ruler, or using a right angled ruler if you have one, drawing this line along the bottom, making sure that that is your right angle here. The next thing we need to do is to measure the neckline of our pattern. So I'm using the back, the yoke, and I'm going to measure from center back here to the shoulder. So using you can either use a tape measure or you can use the curving edge of your ruler. So measuring around, I'm getting 10.5. So write that down here, 10.5, and then mark on that point. So this here for our collar is the center back. 10.5 is our shoulder. And now we need to measure from the shoulder to the center front on the neckline, which is this pattern piece here. So we're measuring, remember to measure along the stitching line and not the cut edge. So I'm measuring from the shoulder around the stitching line to the center front, and that's 13, and marking that 13 on here. Now I'm going to measure up 1.5 and mark that, and rule this line up so that I have this junction here. Now this is the same technique, the beginning of the same technique that you would use to create a stand, but we're going to join the shoulder with the center front point here using a French curve. Like that. Now when you raise this line, you'll find that it lengthens a little bit, but we want to keep that center front on 13 centimeters. So we go back and measure from the shoulder 13 centimeters to here and mark this point. At this point, we're going to go up. No, we're not going up. That would be to create a stand collar. Now back here to the center back, I'm going to have a look at how long I would like that collar. So imagining this is the center back of your neck and the collar. How high do you want that collar sitting up? So if you want the collar coming to about here, the length on the other side needs to come a little bit past that line. So I'm going to say 8 centimetres for my finished collar length. So 8 centimetres, and then marking across here 8 centimetres. So I'm measuring 8 centimetres from the original parallel line and ruling that across. So this edge of the collar sits into the neckline, and this is the top edge of the collar that folds down. So from here to here, we're going to create the point of the collar. I am happy for you to decide at what angle. So we're connecting this center front point to somewhere along here. So that is up to you. I'm really happy for you to choose the angle along here that you take, so that when we cut it in calico and drape it on the mannequin, we'll have an idea about what that style ends up looking like and what that shaping is. So I've created now my pattern. I've got my notches. I'm going to cut this out in calico. Before I finish the pattern, I'm going to cut it out in calico and have a little look at it on the stand. So I've prepped some calico. Again, it's about 15 centimetres wide and about 50 to 60 centimetres long. That will give me enough. I'm going to mark here this centre back fold. And I'm marking along the bottom. So 1 centimetre from the cut edge or the torn edge. The torn edge down here means that I know this is straight grain. Make sure your calico is pressed before you cut it out or place it on the mannequin. So again, just quickly repeating those steps. We have 10.5 centimetres to here. We have 13 centimetres to here. Up 1.5, and then using our French curve to connect those 2 points, the shoulder with that point, 8 centimetres up here and then across. 8 centimetres, 8 centimetres. And marking this last angle on. Now I'm going to fold this very carefully, pin it and cut it out before we can play with it on the mannequin. I've drawn it and folded it. I'm going to mark on my 6 millimetres seam allowance across the bottom. Pop a pin in it and then cut it out. So because I'm not creating a final pattern yet, I'm going to cut along this edge, which will just so that I can see on the mannequin the finished edge. I'm leaving only seam allowance along here where I connect it to the body of my toile. Okay, marking my shoulder notch and the centre back. Now I'm ready to pin. And now we're going to pin it onto the mannequin. So I've prepared this little toile of the neckline of our boyfriend shirt block. Now I have marked on it the centre front on both sides. I've drawn on the neckline, the 6mm stitching line all around the neck, and I've also stay stitched it to help hold that neckline as we're draping it on the mannequin so that it doesn't stretch out. Here's the collar that we just cut out. I've got the centre back marked on it, and I'm going to start by pinning the centre back onto the centre back of the mannequin. So starting here, because I've used a nice thick texture, it's actually helpful because it means that I can see the stitching line on both sides of the fabric. So starting I have my centre back line here marked. I've also made sure that the centre back of this garment and the centre front of the toile is sitting on the tape, the centre front and the centre back tape of the mannequin. So I'm going to start with my stitching line, matching them up at the centre back and then curving it around. I've got my shoulder notches, so that's matching nicely with my shoulder stitching line. And popping a couple more pins in. So it looks like I need to move that down. Okay, so pinning all the way around. So making sure that you're pinning stitching line on top of the stitching line. Okay, so I've pinned one side, now we'll pin the other. It's a bit tricky when you are catching the underneath of the mannequin as well sometimes. Alrighty, so now we can turn it over and have a little look. So remembering on this edge, we've got our seam allowance still on the neckline, so if you want to see what it looks like without that seam allowance, you can pin it out of the way. And that's starting to give you a pretty good idea of the shape of your collar. Here at this point, you can decide whether you want to trim some, whether you want to add some, or reshape it in any way. The other thing that this process has done is made sure that your centre fronts are matching properly. I'm a little bit out on the left side, so that makes me think either my sewing has stretched it a little bit or my cutting is a little bit out, and so I'm going to go back and check my patterns before finishing the pattern pieces. Okie dokie, once you've taken the collar off the mannequin, you bring it back to the original pattern. Now you can see here there is a little difference between the line that I drew originally and the end that I cut. Now I quite liked the shape that I cut, so I'm going to use that one, marking that onto my pattern. If you made any other changes to the depth or to the shape or to this area, this part of the collar point, then this is when you transfer it to your pattern. Okay, now I've got my shape. I just need to add seam allowance all the way around. So the same as our other collar in the two-piece collar, we add 6 millimeters all the way around. I'm going to rub out that original line and 6 millimeters around here on the neckline. And I'm going to rub out this original line across the bottom. Okay, marking here my shoulder and extending this stitching line down here so I get the correct position for the notch at this point. Now we're going to create, this will be the top collar and the under collar will be the same, exactly the same shape, but 3 mils smaller. So rather than drawing it again or tracing it, I'm going to pin, as I cut this one out, I'm pinning underneath another piece of paper already folded. I'm going to make sure that it's pinned right on the folded edge before I cut out the two patterns. Okay. Okay, while it's pinned in position, transferring the notches to the back and to the under collar as well. Okay, and unpinning. So this will be my top collar. This is my under collar. And I'm going to trim 3 millimeters across the top. Again, putting some pins in so that it doesn't move. The reason we're making the under collar smaller is so that when you sew it together, it helps the collar, if the underneath is smaller, it helps it to curve around and sit down like this rather than flapping up like that around the neck. So again, making sure I've got my notches marked on both sides. Okay, I'm going to unpin it and have a look. That's looking pretty good. We also need to include, so now we're ready for grain lines and labelling. So we include a centre back notch on the neck and the top edge of the collar. For the grain lines, you can use either straight or cross grain. One collar. This is cut oneself. Block fusing. And then your numbering and sizing. For the undercollar, we can also use either of the grains. Sometimes when creating undercollars or a facing, for example, in a cuff or a jacket, we might use a bias grain also to assist in the curving of the shape that we're creating. So for this one, I'll leave it as a straight grain, but sometimes you will see that pattern makers will use a bias on an undercollar. So finishing the labelling. I realise I need to write top collar here and under collar on this one. Cut oneself. and block fusing. Finish with marking your notches. When you have a notch that's continuing on an angle, making sure the notch is sitting in line with that stitching line, in the direction of the stitching line, rather than sitting perpendicular to the cut edge. So top notches. Okie dokie, and we have finished your all-in-one collar pattern.